Welcome back to another episode of Breacher's Syndrome 3. In today's episode, we'll dive into a critical topic, Breacher's Syndrome and military occupational specialties. Specifically, we'll focus on which military occupational specialties, or MOS, are at a higher risk for this condition. Let's break it down. Breacher's Syndrome is a term used to describe a set of neurological symptoms. Breacher's Syndrome is a neurological disorder observed in military and law enforcement personnel who are repeatedly exposed to low-level explosive blasts, leading to brain changes and other neurodegenerative disorders. Basically, in short, resulting from repeated exposure to explosive concussive forces. This can lead to chronic brain damage, cognitive decline, and other severe mental and physical health issues. So, which military professionals are most susceptible to this dangerous syndrome? Let's explore. Let's start with the highest risk group, Special Operations Forces. These elite units are constantly exposed to high-intensity combat and explosives. From explosive breaching to underwater demolitions, their jobs inherently put them at risk for Breacher's Syndrome. Navy SEALs, for example, regularly engage in explosive breaching operations. The shock waves from these explosions can cause rapid changes in brain pressure, leading to cumulative damage over time. Similarly, Army Special Forces, also known as the Green Berets, engage in explosive breaching, close-quarters combat, and high-intensity combat operations, like their other special operations brothers. The exposure to blast overpressure is frequent and intense. Marine Raiders, like their counterparts in SOCOM, use similar breaching techniques and face repeated low-level blast exposure. Then we have the Army Rangers. These highly trained soldiers are at high risk because their combat missions often involve high explosives and heavy weapons fire. Explosive ordnance disposal technicians handle and neutralize explosives. Their job places them in incredibly close proximity to detonations, making them one of the highest risk military occupational specialties for Breacher's Syndrome. Air Force Pararescue personnel also face constant exposure to blast waves. Whether rescuing in combat zones or engaging in high-risk operations, their exposure is significant. Lastly, Air Force Special Operations Forward. Observers are exposed to constant blast waves and high-stress combat environments. This exposure makes them especially vulnerable to Breacher's Syndrome. Next up, infantry and heavy weapons operators. These soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are often on the front lines of combat, where explosive devices and heavy weapons fire are a daily occurrence. Take infantrymen, whether they're Army or Marine Corps, soldiers and riflemen who are exposed to IEDs, artillery fire, and breaching explosions, face repetitive concussive forces that can contribute to neurological damage. Combat engineers are another group at risk. These specialists perform demolitions, mine clearance, and breaching operations. Repeated exposure to blasts from these operations puts them at a significant risk for Breacher's Syndrome. Field artillery crew members and mortarmen are regularly exposed to artillery and mortar blasts. These shock waves are strong enough to cause serious damage to the brain over time. Even tank crewmen are not immune. Their sustained exposure to shock waves from tank cannon fire, whether in training or combat, can have long-term effects on their brain health. Moving on to the next category, aviation and shipboard personnel. Door gunners, for example, are exposed to rapid-fire systems mounted on aircraft. The force of these weapons creates powerful shock waves, putting these aircrews at significant risk. Pilots involved in high-intensity aerial combat missions face intense exposure to blast waves from munitions, which can create concussive forces similar to those faced by ground combatants. Likewise, naval gunfire support personnel aboard ships regularly deal with large-caliber weapons and artillery fire, exposing them to blast waves from shipboard artillery. Lastly, let's talk about military police and security forces, especially those who serve in special operations units. SWAT SRT operators with their special assignments often participate in breaching operations and are exposed to flashbang concussions and explosive devices. These exposures add up over time, contributing to Breacher's Syndrome. So why are these MOS at such high risk for breacher's syndrome? Let's break it down. First, explosive breaching is a major risk factor. The shockwaves from door and wall charges cause rapid pressure changes in the brain, which can lead to brain injury. It's that simple. Next, there's heavy weapons fire. Repeated exposure to shockwaves from large caliber weapons such as artillery can have cumulative effects on brain health. Close proximity to blasts, like those from demolitions or artillery, can create repetitive low-level concussive forces. These forces damage brain cells over time, leading to breacher's syndrome. Finally, IED exposure is one of the most dangerous threats. The blast overpressure from improvised explosive devices causes immediate and long-term damage, putting soldiers at high risk for traumatic brain injury. Frequent sub-concussive blows in football and blast-induced rapid pressure changes in breachers. Both contribute to cumulative B, sharing pathophysiological and chronic traumatic syndrome through neuroinflammation, tauopathy, and chronic neurodegeneration. Let's do a quick review of the high risk for TBI breacher's syndrome in military occupational specialties. As we have discussed, the term breacher's syndrome is a term used to describe the neurological and cognitive effects of repeated blast exposures, particularly in military personnel involved in breaching operations. These individuals, often part of Special Operations Forces or combat engineers, EOD, are exposed to rapid pressure changes from explosive breaches, leading to sub-concussive and concussive brain injuries. The syndrome shares similarities with CTE and other blast-related neurotrauma, as it involves neuroinflammation, tau deposition, and progressive cognitive and behavioral changes. The nexus to military occupational specialties, MOS, is strongest in roles requiring frequent exposure to blast overpressure, such as breachers. EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, technicians and heavy weapons operators, increasing their risk for long-term neurodegenerative conditions. As we've learned today, breacher's syndrome is a real and pressing concern for many military and the civilian tactical law enforcement community professionals. Those in special operations, infantry, aviation, military police, and tactical law enforcement are constantly exposed to concussive and subconcussive forces that can take a toll on their brain health over years to even decades later. It's crucial for the U.S. Armed Forces to continue researching ways to minimize these risks, including better protective gear, tactics, and medical treatments. At the Robin's Nest Neuro Alliance, we stand by the belief that no warrior should be left behind. Not on the battlefield, not in recovery, and not in the fight against the invisible wounds, traumatic brain injuries. Breacher's syndrome, like chronic traumatic encephalopathy, seen in athletes in sports like football, and other blast-related neurotrauma, is a reality that too many of our veterans face long after they've left the service. The science is evolving, but what remains constant is our duty to understand, advocate, and support those who have sacrificed for us. Knowledge is power, and together, we can push for better recognition, care, and solutions for those living with the consequences of repeated blast exposure. If you're someone you know is struggling, don't walk that road alone. Stand with your brothers and sisters, reach out, and keep the conversation going. Healing begins with awareness, and change happens when we refuse to look away. No one fights alone, and no one gets left behind. Stay strong, stay informed, and continue lifting each other up, because the mission isn't over until we've brought everyone home. Until next time, take care. Like and subscribe to the Robin's Nest Alliance.